Hey, good morning, everyone. It's Sunday, September 15th. I'm Mark Dent, and you're listening to the Hustle Daily Show. We're going to have a conversation about money today, specifically the money that flows from corporations or the leaders who run those corporations into the U.S. political system. The money is basically an investment. The corporations believe it's going to help them make more in the long run. So far in this 2024 federal campaign cycle, several billion dollars has been pumped into races for Congress, for the Senate, and obviously for president. According to the Washington Post, some $1.5 billion alone has come from just 50 influential donors who are involved in all sorts of industries like shipping, crypto, you name it. And all of this giving, of course, is perfectly legal, thanks to various bills and Supreme Court decisions that go back decades. But David Sirota has a different word to describe these kinds of transactions: corruption. Sirota is the founder and editor-in-chief of the investigative news outlet The Lever, as well as a former Bernie Sanders speechwriter and the co-writer of the movie Don't Look Up. Over the last couple of years, Sirota and some other folks at The Lever have investigated how America came to have the corporate and political environments that we have today in a podcast series called The Master Plan. You can listen to the first few episodes of The Master Plan wherever you get your podcasts. And today, we're going to talk to David all about money and corporations and how their influence has affected the lives of normal Americans. David, thanks so much for coming on to the Hustle Daily Show.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, so you kind of subtitle this podcast, The Master Plan, as sort of uncovering a plot to legalize corruption. How would you describe legalized corruption exactly? And what are some ways that we can visibly see it today in how it affects people and maybe benefits businesses?
So the way a democracy is supposed to work is one person has one vote. We elect our representatives who then represent the broad public interest in Congress when making decisions. What money does is money becomes more powerful than the one person, one vote paradigm by giving those with money the ability to disproportionately communicate with voters, with the electorate, to drown out other potential views and to promote the views of those giving the money. So money corrupts the process of democracy by giving disproportionately more political power to those with money than to those without money. And what has happened over the last 50 years is that through a series of laws, through a series of court rulings, the ability, the legality of trading money for public policy favors has expanded. It's become basically legal to give money in support of electing a political candidate and then expecting a government favor in return for that investment. That may be a good business strategy, as you suggest. It makes sense from the donor's perspective to make an investment in a politician and then get a government favor in return. That's a good business decision, but that is not democracy, or at least not how democracy is supposed to function. And we have to understand that while bribery and corruption has always been part of the human condition, to make it easier, to make it legal to do that in a democracy is effectively the crisis of democracy. So what our podcast Master Plan does is it traces the decision points on the way to make it much easier to effectively encourage this kind of behavior in a way that it wasn't encouraged. It wasn't part of our culture before these changes since Watergate happened.
Yeah, so tell me a little bit, how did it get started? Who was involved? Which people, which businesses were the first to kind of begin this plot to kind of change the way things were, like you were saying, for us having more of this one-to-one sort of democracy kind of feel to what we have?
So when the Watergate scandal happened, it was this very important few years where the forces of reform, the forces of democracy, were winning lots of battles in Congress. We're talking about Medicare, Medicaid, the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency, the Clean Air Act, the Voting Rights Act. All of the fast reforms of the mid and late 1960s into the early 1970s. That was the government being, in the context of today, unimaginably responsive to demands from the public. And the corporate sector was freaked out.
And the corporations were freaked out because the government was responding to people who wanted a little bit more like environmental type of regulations, different things like that.
Corporate America basically saw itself as under attack. It saw the so-called free market system under attack by the democratic, small d, democratic reforms that were happening in the day. I mean, if you were a corporate polluter in the 1950s and the 1960s, all of a sudden the government is creating the Environmental Protection Agency saying you can't just dump the chemical in the river. Now, multiply that by scores and scores of policies that were passing in the 1960s and early 1970s, and corporate America felt under attack, felt its freedom under attack. And a guy named Lewis Powell, a tobacco industry lawyer, an industry, by the way, that also felt under attack by public health advocates and public health regulations, he authored this outline of how corporations and oligarchs needed to get much more involved in influencing politics. And this was called the Powell Memo. Lewis Powell, who very soon after, months later, was installed on the Supreme Court. And part of the focus of the Powell Memo, and the Powell Memo was sponsored by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, part of the focus was to deregulate the campaign finance system. That campaign finance, the ability to buy and sell elections, buy and sell lawmakers, was key to people with lots of money getting their way rather than letting the public get its way. Now, as I mentioned, this was all happening additionally in concurrence with the Watergate scandal. And adding to the fears of corporate America at the time was it came out, and this is the forgotten part of Watergate. People know the break-in. Watergate was funded in part by illegal campaign donations from major blue chip brand name corporations in America and their executives. And those executives and those corporations were prosecuted for those illegal campaign contributions. It's kind of hard to imagine corporations and executives, people with power getting, in a high profile way prosecuted, but that actually happened. So corporate America's freaked out and corporate America goes to work.
What was in it for Powell? You go into him, of course, a bit on the podcast, but why was Powell the one? You mentioned, of course, also that he represented big tobacco while working for a law firm. But why was he the one who really wanted to carry the water for corporate America?
So he was a major corporate lawyer in Richmond, Virginia. He was on the board of Philip Morris. He was deeply involved in a number of corporate clients. And I think what happened with him, he ultimately ended up as the head of the American Bar Association. So this is a guy who was kind of at the pinnacle of the legal profession right before he wrote the memo and right before he was installed on the Supreme Court, right? You're kind of a big political deal if you're on the short list to be appointed to the Supreme Court. And I think what happened was, what we can tell that happened, was that he became radicalized along with various now icons of the conservative movement during the tumult of the 1960s. He became a source for J. Edgar Hoover to surveil the legal profession for alleged communists. He began giving speeches against the protesters of the 1960s and the movements of the 1960s. And again, concurrently to icons like Ronald Reagan and Barry Goldwater ascending and William F. Buckley. So I think he got caught up in that movement from a business legal perspective, right? He was in the business and legal community.
Right.
And then he writes his memo for the Chamber of Commerce, which it should be noted is the most powerful corporate umbrella group in Washington. He writes this memo and the Chamber of Commerce goes to work. The Chamber of Commerce forms a task force on the Powell Memo, that's what it was called, with corporate executives from some of the biggest and most powerful companies across the country to implement some of the directives of the Powell Memo. And again, the Powell Memo is long, it's detailed. There's a lot of talk about influencing American popular culture, influencing the education system, but there's a real focus on politics, on elections, and I should mention, on taking back, I'm putting that in quotes, taking back the judiciary, judicial activism. And I think it's important to note that means both the political activism necessary to get corporate-friendly judges appointed to the court, but also to bring particular kinds of cases to the courts to try to get particular kinds of rulings. They wanted to rip a page out of the playbook of Ralph Nader. Ralph Nader, it's hard to remember. I mean, before I was born. Just to give people a sense of what was going on at this time, Ralph Nader was a celebrity at that point. He was considered one of the most powerful political figures in the United States.
Because he'd led so much reforms, safety reforms, environmental reforms, everything, right?
Exactly. And he used the legal system. He would bring lawsuits. They would do legislative activism, but they would bring lawsuits to try to secure favorable rulings and environmental rulings, public health rulings, and the like. And so what the right did was, through the Powell Memo movement and these task forces, was create an infrastructure to do the same thing, but for corporate America. So out of that, you get legal groups like the Pacific Legal Foundation, to name one of many, that started bringing cases to the Supreme Court, to the federal courts. Mm-hmm. At the same time, they were trying to get particular nominees on the courts, including, as I mentioned, Lewis Powell, to try to get rulings that would make the environment more favorable to business.
Okay.
And one last point on this is they very quickly started securing rulings to deregulate the campaign finance system, because they knew that the more money they could pump into this political operation, the more they would be able to implement their entire agenda.
There were also, as you reveal in the podcast, there were also a lot of meetings about the Powell Memo. And some of these happened in Florida, at Disney World, in fact. And I think one happened in Dallas.
Yep.
And there was also a third. But who were at these meetings? Like, which corporations, which business leaders were really involved in trying to kind of put the Powell Memo, which again was all about free enterprise and kind of keeping business going as it is without a lot of regulation? Who was really involved in this? Like, are these names and corporations we would know of?
Yeah, I mean, it was a real cross-section. I mean, there were political lobbying groups, as I mentioned, like the Chamber of Commerce. There were titans of corporations like Amway. There were media corporations. One of the top executives of CBS was a participant on the Powell Memo task force. There were also a lot of these representatives of these big privately held corporations from sort of long-standing old private empires, Olin, Scaife, Coors. So it was a real cross-section of major public companies. Typically, I should mention industrial companies, manufacturing companies, as well as media corporations, as well as a lot of these privately held empires.
Sure. What do you think they all kind of had in common? You mentioned that a lot were kind of industry, but also like media, CBS. You don't really tend to think of them as necessarily being all about the same thing. What do you think kind of brought them together?
Honestly, I think it's that, for one thing, it's that they all like lower taxes. They all like less regulation. And I think what the Powell Memo did and what these task forces did was find common ground among a cross-section of the business elite. In other words, this or that manufacturing company may have specific policy goals when it comes to pollution regulations that CBS may not care about, that the Olin Corporation may not care about, but they all care about a core set of ideologies and policies when it comes to lowering taxes, when it comes to eliminating regulations, when it comes to disempowering the labor movement, when it comes to touting all of the policies that we consider under quote unquote free market economics. And the Chamber of Commerce, I think, served as a convener of that. And so to get a pro-business set of judges into the courts would ultimately end up, I'll give you an example, delivering the recent ruling on the so-called Chevron doctrine. Think about that ruling. I mean, it's a perfect ruling. It just happened recently. The Chevron doctrine was a doctrine in the judicial system which said that basically the executive branch appointees can take laws passed by Congress and implement the granular details of those laws. The Chevron doctrine has been used as a legal justification for all sorts of basic regulations. So when the Congress passes the Clean Air Act or the Clean Water Act, they don't actually say this is exactly how much poison can be in the water or air. They leave it up to scientists at the Environmental Protection Agency. So what happened recently was The legal movement created out of the Powell memo movement, out of the effort to legalize corruption, the legal movement that emerged from that has been pushing to get rid of that doctrine. Why? Because every major corporation wants less government regulation, wants the government to be unable to tell it what it can do, how it can do business, and what it's not allowed to do in terms of abusing the rest of the country. So point being is that that's the kind of thing that ultimately is an outgrowth of a political system in which money picks the judges, money funds the lawsuits, money elects the people who make the decisions about what the legislation says.
Yeah. One thing that I got to wondering while listening to the first couple episodes of the podcast was basically who wanted this more? Was it the government officials or the businesses themselves? And I'll explain a little bit more. Like you get into, I think on the first episode, a story about Richard Nixon and the dairy industry, which started to lobby because they wanted to have, more or less higher prices for milk. And they had normally supported largely the Democrats. And they're like, well, we can shift our money toward you on the conservative side if you help us out. And so I just wondered, did all of this sort of movement to, again, this kind of system we have today where corporations can put in a lot of money and politicians can accept that money, it clearly benefits both. But who wanted it first and who wanted it more? Is it better for the businesses or is it better for the politicians? Because like in the case of Nixon, it allowed him to have more TV ads, which helped him get elected, for instance.
I think you're touching on the fact that it's symbiotic and self-selecting. So when you have a politics that's based on who can raise the most money in order to most often communicate with voters and drown out the other side, when you create a politics like that, naturally the people who are going to win most often are the people who are most talented in vacuuming in the most money. And I put talented in quotes because what we're really saying is willing to offer up the prospect of government policy favors in exchange for money to fund a campaign. So I think it's kind of symbiotic in that once you create that system, once money becomes determinative of electoral outcomes and political outcomes, naturally the people who rise to the top are the people who are best at doing the transaction of exchanging campaign money for what the donor wants. Now, at a certain level, you're right. From the giver's perspective, sometimes it can feel extortive. I'm sure when you mentioned the dairy industry in episode 1 of Master Plan, this sort of forgotten story, caught on tape, by the way, of Richard Nixon quite literally saying that his administration is going to, quote, shake down the dairy producers for more campaign money in exchange for the price supports that would raise the price of milk to enrich those same dairy processors. I'm sure at some level, the dairy processors probably felt a little extorted, like, hey, we want this policy. We can't make a pitch necessarily on the merits of the policy to hey, Mr. President, we need you to do this because it's good for the public. Instead, it was, we have to cough up $90,000 a month to Richard Nixon's presidential campaign in order to get the policy that we want. In some ways, that's extortive, except for the fact, we go back to what we talked about at the beginning, the ROI. Right? The ROI for the investors in this, let's call them that, not donors, investors. The ROI for the donor class in this now system of legalized bribery and legalized corruption is so vast. We talked about, $3 billion, $4 billion are going to be spent in the election. That's $3 or $4 billion spent in an election to elect a government that spends $1 trillion, $1.5 trillion, right? So the ROI of corporate America can spend $2-3 billion on elections and then get access to a pot of money that's $1.5 trillion of spending, much less regulations and tax cuts and the like. I mean, is that extortive or is that a sort of can't lose investment? I would say it's a can't lose investment right now when there doesn't seem to be any pushback, any resistance to giving most of the donor class what they want.
Corporations They started doing this, starting in the 70s and for the last few decades, and they want to be able to donate money and, hope that the government will help them out. And they'll probably say that's because it's good for the economy. We're going to do things that are good for the economy. We're going to create jobs. Do you think that's a valid justification when you hear corporations say things like that? And also a lot of the different foundations who kind of back them say those same things.
Sure. I mean, that's the old adage that what's good for GM is good for America. The idea being the more you can unencumber business, the more you can give big business public money, the better it will ultimately be for the macro economy and the better it will be for the average American. I think that social contract has broken down. I think that when you look at most economic indicators in America, that the macro economy can be doing quite well and the microeconomic lived experience of the average American can not be going all that well. I think that's what we've seen over the last many years now. I mean, there's been this whole debate in politics of late. Why are the economic numbers so good, but people are pissed off about the economy? Is it just that they're misled, that just people are dumb, just people that are deluded? No. I would say that we now have an economy where those at the top, corporations, their executives, billionaires, they can be doing quite well. The macro economy can be doing quite well, but the lived economic experience can be miserable. Costs going up, the cost of housing, the cost of basic necessities, housing, healthcare, food, shelter, right? I mean, the macro economy doesn't necessarily now translate to a better lived experience. And I want to add, I think that's in part because of the policies that have been rigged by the legalization of corruption. Because remember, when we talk about corruption being legalized, we're not just talking about what favors are granted to corporations and big donors. We're talking about what the government also will then avoid doing, what the government is deterred from doing. This is a key part. And I can tell you, having worked on campaigns, you can see it in real time if you've ever worked on a major political campaign. It's to say this, that oftentimes politicians will not want to get involved in issues, will not want to propose obvious solutions to problems for fear that they're going to be spent into the ground on their next election campaign. In a world of Citizens United that allows corporations and billionaires to spend in an unlimited fashion on super PACs in elections, the average senator may not want to say, hey, listen, I think, for instance, the health insurance companies are fleecing America, ruining the country, immiserating millions of people, and we need to seriously limit insurance companies' involvement in the healthcare system. A politician going out and saying that and proposing legislation to do something about that runs the risk that the next time they run for re-election, the insurance industry now, in a deregulated campaign finance system, is going to spend zillions of dollars to unseat them from their legislative seat. So oftentimes what happens is the politician will say, yeah, I acknowledge the health insurance industry is immiserating the entire country, but I can't really say much of anything for fear of losing my job because of the money politics that we now exist in.
And do you think if there was some reform and the campaign finance laws were changed, that we had some new judicial rulings, and it became a lot harder for corporations to give, a lots of money, would we actually see politicians start to change things and go back to you were mentioning earlier, 1970, 1971 or so, when there had been a lot of progress made on different regulations? I mean, do you think that politicians would actually want to do that, or could there still be this sort of friendly relationship with businesses?
Put it this way, I don't think it's a panacea. I don't think it fixes everything, but I certainly think there are a couple of obvious reforms that would make it more likely, or at least liberate elected officials to better consider what their voters want rather than only what their donors want. First and foremost, there is a piece of legislation that really should not be controversial that's been sitting in Congress for 10 years that's called the Disclose Act, which would at minimum at least require basic disclosure of who is spending money in elections. Right now, dark money, which is the anonymous money, When you turn on your television during the election season and you see tons of ads funded by ridiculously named groups like, Citizens for American Citizens, right? These are dark money groups. You don't even know who's talking to you. And that's because there are no real laws on the books forcing super PACs, which are the sort of political entity of the day in the post-Citizens United world, forcing them to say, okay, at least here, American public, you can see who's talking to you. So at minimum, we should have the right to know who's trying to influence our vote, who's trying to buy our elections. That legislation shouldn't be controversial. I mean, Antonin Scalia, the most conservative justice in the last 50 years, was the guy who said that basic disclosure laws are required for democracy. Even the Citizens United ruling said that such disclosure laws are important, and yet we don't have them. So that's one thing that can be done. I would say bigger and more important thing that can be done is publicly financed elections, which is to say that giving people who run for office the option to run a decently financed campaign that doesn't require them to solicit private money asking for government favors, giving candidates the option, another way to run for office, in which they have resources to run a campaign, resources that aren't requiring them, demanding of them government favors in return. To me, that could be a game changer. And to be clear, Congress has gotten very close to doing that twice in the last 50 years. Once right after Watergate and once right after the Keating 5 scandal in the late 1980s into the 1990s. Congress has gotten very close to doing that. At one point in the early 90s, it was actually passed, and President George H.W. Bush vetoed it. My point in saying that is that it sounds like a far-flung idea, but we've gotten very close as a country to doing that. Now, I know the argument. The argument is we're just going to spend government money on government officials. This is a handout for politicians. But here's the thing. Right now, we have the best government money can buy, the best government corporate money can buy. Now, I would say the results are not so great. I would say that if we want a government that represents the public interest, the public has to cough up some resources to purchase that government for ourselves. And I think that's the only civilized way to really do business in a country that purports to be a democracy. Otherwise, you get elections that are effectively auctions, which is what we have now.
One more question to kind of move this back to the corporations. I'm curious, are there any industries, any businesses that you know of that aren't happy with this system?
The businesses that this system harms are small and medium-sized businesses. This is a system for big business and billionaires. We're talking about Fortune 500 companies, privately held behemoths, oligarchs, billionaires. That's what this system serves. The average mid-sized and small business is run roughshod over by government policy almost all the time in so many obvious ways. So I'm glad we're mentioning this because I want to be precise that we're talking about a system that rewards the biggest of big guys, whether it's at the individual level, billionaires versus the rest of us, or at the business level, we're talking about huge Fortune 500 companies and not small business.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think we're going to leave it there. David, thank you again for coming on the show. If you want to check out his podcast, it's called The Master Plan, and the first few episodes are already out, and they will be released weekly on Tuesdays. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in for us today at The Hustle Daily Show. We're a proud part of the HubSpot Podcast Network. Our editor today is Robert Hartwig, and our executive producer is Darren Clark. We've got a lot more tech and business coverage in our newsletter. So if you're not subscribed, please go get signed up at thehustle.co/email, and we will catch you tomorrow.